Welcome to the Albertine Order, where we seek to recover past learning and wisdom that has been lost, unfortunately, during the great flame deluge of the past 100 years. In science fiction book Canticle for Leibowitz, the world was destroyed by a nuclear war, and after this, the mobs of people turned against all the scientists and scholars, killed them, and all that was left were just bits and pieces of knowledge, until Isaac Leibowitz, a Jewish electrical engineer, began to gather the lost information in a Catholic abbey. He eventually joined the abbey and started a new religious order, the Albertine Order of Leibowitz, to gather, preserve, and copy lost texts. Of course, the monks have no idea what it is they are copying, because all the people who understood it are dead. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre comments on this story in his book After Virtue, that we are in a similar situation today regarding how to be virtuous. There's no one left to teach us. And good gracious, we are in the same trouble when it comes to how do we know the truth and what is beauty or what is a good society or any of the big questions in life. So I am Brother Michael, broadcasting live, not so live, in my first rudimentary video, coming to you from the Albertine Abbey of the Blessed Leibowitz. I am coming to give a short talk today about the following question in epistemology, or the study of how we know things, or as some people say, the study of boring words that I don't understand. Here's the question: can we be certain of things that we do not know by logical demonstration? For example, can I be certain that my wife loves me? Now, many modern philosophers have concluded we cannot have certainty about those kinds of things. They think, people like Descartes and Locke think that the material world is always unreliable. The only thing we can really know about are the unchangeable things like logic, mathematical principles, and so on. If we don't have this logical or mathematical certainty about changeable empirical things, then do we even have any kind of certainty at all in bigger questions like, is Christianity true? So in this talk, I'm going to explain the arguments from John Henry Newman's book, The Grammar of Assent. Newman attempts to solve this problem by examining the way our minds actually work in these cases. He argues that we indeed can have certainty about many things in the empirical world, or ordinary things, or even religious beliefs. So, first of all, to anyone watching this who is wondering, well, what's the point in all this? To ordinary folk, all of this seems ridiculous because it seems that we can have certainty about all kinds of things, and that's just obvious. So why would we question that? To most people, the idea that their spouse loves them is so obvious that why ask the question? Or to question whether there's actually gravitation, or or whether you were born on your birthday. That seems ridiculous. Why even bother with this? Newman is actually going to sympathize with this kind of question because he bases some of his argument on our common sense experience of the world, as we will see. But he also gives an argument for why it's important to know why we believe things. That's the whole point of this book, Grammar of Assent. Here's a quote from Newman on this to give us encouragement to take up these kinds of questions. He says, "I consider that in the case of educated minds, investigations into the argumentative proof of things to which they have given their assent is an obligation, or rather a necessity. Such a trial of their intellects is a law of their nature, like the growth of childhood into manhood, and analogous to the moral ordeal which is the instrument of their spiritual life. The lessons of right and wrong, which they are taught them at school, are to be carried out into action amid the good and evil of the world." And so again, the intellectual assents in which they have in like manner been instructed from the first, have to be tested, realized, and developed by exercise of their mature judgment. In other words, if we fancy ourselves educated people, we ought to investigate the foundation of our beliefs in order to become mature, educated people. Newman points out later, this doesn't involve suspending our beliefs, say in Christianity, atheism, or in basic certainties, such as whether you are actually watching this video right now. One can investigate one's belief without actually doubting that belief. Newman points out that this is very different from someone who's agnostic or just doesn't know, making an inquiry into a subject for the first time. Now, it may be the case that our beliefs are borne out by reality. We look into them, we investigate them, we find out they're true. Back to the main question, how is it that we can have certainty about things that at best seem only probable? The way that Newman goes about solving this problem in his book, Grammar of Assent, is multifaceted. To explain his argument, first we have to look a little bit at preliminary assumptions. First of all, Newman thinks that Aristotle and Aquinas, that we must start with given reality. We can't start with universal doubt because this will lead to all kinds of absurdities, like the belief that I can't be certain that my wife loves me and that she wouldn't poison me when she serves breakfast to me in the morning. Instead, we start with reality as we find it. So Newman thinks we have to start with reality as given. We're not doubting everything whole cloth. I'll come back to that point a little bit later. So Newman argues that the probability and assent are different things. Probability is not certain. We also do not have to even assent to a probable conclusion. For example, say I've read somewhere that Shakespeare was a secret Catholic, and I'm sure there's a variety of evidence to support this proposition. Yet I could possibly hear all that evidence and still not agree or assent to that proposition. Perhaps I just don't want to believe that one of the greatest writers of all time was Catholic. Assent, on the other hand, is our agreement with or resting in a proposition. For example, if I agreed with the proposition, bats are birds. Let's say when I was a child, a fellow child told me that bats are birds. And he explained that they fly like birds, they make noises kind of like birds, and they're birds. I assented to this proposition. I would just simply agree with that proposition if I assented. Newman points out you can't half agree. You either agree or you don't agree. You can't have 50% or 75% assent to a proposition. If you had that, you would actually not assent. You'd be withholding your assent to the proposition. Some would say, though, that we clearly can assent to things that are only probable. We are assenting that is probably the case. So in that case, assent is still something entirely given or not. But what about another question? Don't we have some beliefs that are stronger than other beliefs? We feel stronger that they are true or not, more certain or less certain. So Newman points out these have to do with the circumstances, the imaginations, the good reasons we have for the assent, not with the assent itself. Assent is still always either given or not. Okay, so we have probability, we have assent. Let's look at the proposition, my wife loves me. I assent to this proposition. I believe that. But do I have certainty about it? I might or I might not. Newman argues that not only is assent, not all assent is justified by the evidence. I may believe that my wife loves me, but it may be that she is a North Korean spy, carefully trained to dissemble that she loves me. Now, perhaps it comes to light that she speaks Korean and that she has been trained in martial arts, that she goes on long business trips and comes back with oddly explained wounds, that I begin overhearing long conversations in Korean at 2 a.m. When I look up the words, They translate to gathering information and maps of military bases and things like that. Well, now my initial belief that she loves me is beginning to unravel. It occurs to me that I may never have had good reason to believe she loved me to begin with. Then again, she might love me and still be a spy. So in order for my assent that my wife loves me to have certitude, it needs to rest on sound reasons. Newman argues that we do have certainty about many things. And one of the reasons we know that is because we can experience that as the case. For example, what I've been talking about, my wife loves me. I have certainty that I believe I have certainty about that proposition. Or in the moral sphere, say the proposition slavery is wrong. I assent to that. I don't have any reservations about that statement. But what kind of sound arguments does certitude actually rest on? How do we move from just assenting to certitude? Newman argues that it doesn't really rest usually on a linear, logical, demonstrative argument. So here's an example of an argument. All those who act loving to their husband love their husband. My wife is one who acts loving towards her husband, and so on. This argument doesn't work as a knockdown demonstration. First of all, because premise one is false. Not all those who act loving to their husband love their husband. But second of all, if I wanted to try to find a way to support that argument, I would have to bring in many other arguments, points of data, and so on to support it. What kind of evidence does certainty rest on? It doesn't rest on just a logical demonstration, because those end up being very complex usually, and arguments about which first principles do they derive from, and so on. Newman thinks instead that certainty like this comes from what he calls converging probabilities. In other words, I have hundreds or maybe even thousands of bits of probable evidence that converge to support the proposition, my wife loves me. The spy theory, were I to entertain it, doesn't fit the facts. That my wife is a North Korean spy doesn't work, or even that she's a sociopath or a narcissist doesn't work. I have too much countervailing evidence. But assume for a moment that this theory of Newman's works out about converging probabilities. How do we know we are truly justified in our belief, in a particular belief that it is certain? The run-of-the-mill people and even educated people or scholars tend to confuse opinion, hearsay, probable reasons, emotional bias. They mix them all together into a big soup, and it becomes very murky to find out when we are actually justified in being certain about a belief. Also, most of us, even the college-educated, do not have the basic intellectual training to investigate these things. Newman gives a little commentary coming to us from 1870 on this. He says, in this day, the subject matter of thought and belief has so increased upon us that a far higher mental formation is required than was necessary in times past, and higher than we have actually reached. The whole world is brought to our doors every morning, and our judgment is required upon social concerns, books, persons, parties, creeds, national acts, political principles, and measures. So that was 150 years ago. Imagine how bad it is today, when we were so inundated with edutainment, as Neil Postman writes in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death. Today, we're even more inundated with ideas, facts, distracting technology, and propaganda. And undoubtedly, there is less higher mental formation than there was just 30 years ago, let alone 150 years ago. As for questions about how we know we are justified in our certainty, back to this question, Newman also wants to encourage us to seek not just notional, but real assent, what he calls real assent. He explains notional assent is the detached arguments, the formulations of various positions, and so on. For example, my belief that it's good to exercise, maybe based on stuff I read or learned in a health class. But my belief that it's good to exercise gets much more real after a year of being stuck inside and a strong temptation to not exercise and the results that come from that. Newman posits that this more real way of seeking information is more relevant to us. It's more motivating, emotional, captivating to our imagination. And therefore, it helps us act on our beliefs. So we need to learn to develop this real assent, along with the notional, the detached arguments. Those are important too, as, to keep us away from just sophistical argumentation or fallacies and so on. Newman is basically saying what we need is head and heart knowledge, as people say. So let's say you want to motivate yourself to exercise. Perhaps you should go somewhere where other people are exercising. You're in a sense, you're entering the liturgy of exercise, and it's becoming a much more real thing. If you want to know there's a God, Newman says, don't just read the books, go by yourself and ponder your sense of moral duty, the sense of moral duty that you really cannot escape from. It bears down on you and me and all human beings alike. Where could such a moral impression to all humanity come from? It's immutable. It's an immutable moral law of kindness, justice, and so forth. Where could that come from? Well, it would make a lot of sense if it came from an infinite, personal, perfect being such as God. It would not make sense if there were no such being and we had this continual experience of the demand for moral perfection on us. We may attempt to downplay it, but if we get alone, get quiet, and ponder that moral reality, Newman says that gives a real apprehension of this argument, which it ties into a notional argument for God. But that is the difference between a real apprehension, a real assent, versus a notional apprehension. Real, much more motivating, captivating, notional, important, but not sufficient in many ways to motivate our actions or our beliefs. Once we have a conjunction of both real and notional assents that support a belief we have, we'll be in a better place to have certainty about a matter. We will have a growing conjunction of probabilities, be moving towards knowing that what we believe is true. But truth is the key, not simply believing what we want. We can't square a circle or make our beliefs fit reality when they just don't. Truth has to fit with reality. So back to the earlier question of whether we can know things with certainty. How do we know this theory of converging probabilities leading to certainty is actually true? Well, in some way, this theory rests on more fundamental assumptions, such as that our intellect has a purpose for which it functions, which is to know truth, and that the material world is real, and there really are other persons that we interact with in this world, and that our experience of assent and certainty are real, and they are not an illusory part of our humanity that we should continually call into doubt. Newman points out that just because people abuse the idea of certainty is not a reason to throw it out. If there's a false certainty, there must be a true certainty. So, of course, everybody has assumptions that undergird their philosophy. Even the most skeptical philosophers such as Descartes or Hume. Hume, for example, thinks that we can only know matters of facts and relation of ideas. Nobody can truly be free of all assumptions. And by saying that Newman's theory rests on these assumptions which help make it sense of it, that's not to say that the assumptions themselves can't be examined. Perhaps we can show that these assumptions are very justified in our acceptance of them. And Newman himself actually writes, "The right of making assumptions has been disputed, but when the objections are examined, I think they will only go to show that we have no right in argument to make any assumption we please." It seems to me that we can begin looking at propositions such as God supernaturally raised Jesus from the dead. We can look at a proposition like that and see if there are large converging probabilities that yield a certainty of assent. Also, Newman points out that in religious matters, there is also faith that can come to us supernaturally and help us assent to divine revelation. Faith is a kind of understanding or sight, an experience that transcends and illuminates our reasoning. So that's another mode of experience, a real kind of assent that we can have about faith that undergirds our faith if we're speaking about a religious faith. One last point that Newman makes is our need for virtue. Certainly practical reasoning or right judgment, from the Greek word phronesis, is very important in the pursuit of truth. He calls this the illative sense. Some people have this innate skill of judgment in particular areas. For example, Michael Jordan in basketball or Alexander Hamilton in political science. We're all better at one thing than another, but still we can sharpen our skill in rightly judging matters through practice, through building a habit. As we practice this practical reason, we can rightly orient our inner faculty of judgment and so aid our process of finding the truth. Thank you for watching this very first episode of the Albertian Order, where we seek to recover lost learning and preserve Christendom after the great flame deluge. God be with you, and don't let the cannibals bite.